Imagine a Sunday evening in August 1971. The summer heat is thick and humid across the eastern seaboard. Families in living rooms from Boston to Baltimore are gathered around their television sets, cold drinks in hand, waiting for the latest episode of Bonanza. The country's favorite Western drama about the Cartwright family and their Nevada ranch has been a Sunday night ritual for over a decade now. Kids are in pajamas, dad's settled into his favorite chair. The familiar theme song is about to begin. But at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, something unusual happens. The music cuts off, the Cartwrights vanish, and in their place appears President Richard Nixon, his face filling the screen in grainy black and white, delivering a primetime address that nobody had expected. What Nixon told the American people that night would change the global monetary system. He announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Just a brief pause, he assured everyone, a necessary measure to defend America against international money speculators. That was over 50 years ago. We're still waiting for the temporary measure to end. Today, we're dissecting how the U.S. suspended the Bretton Woods convertibility commitment at $35 per ounce and how it was framed as a patriotic rescue mission. We'll follow the money from the ashes of World War II to a secret meeting at Camp David. We'll expose how the U.S. simply did not have enough gold to honor its commitments to foreign governments. And we'll reveal how France became an early visible challenger and how broader conversions and market pressure accelerated the crisis. Welcome to the day money died. To understand why Nixon slammed the gold window shut, we need to go back to a New Hampshire resort town in the summer of 1944. The war was still raging across Europe and the Pacific, but the Allied powers were already planning for peace. They had seen what happened when the global financial system collapsed in the 1930s. Currency wars, trade wars, beggar-thy-neighbor policies that impoverished nations and bred the desperation that brought fascists to power. Representatives from 44 countries gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, determined to never let that happen again. The resort, nestled in the White Mountains, seemed like an unlikely birthplace for a new world order. Delegates sweated through July in wool suits, debating monetary theory while the fate of civilization hung in the balance across the Atlantic. But what emerged from those 3 weeks of negotiations would shape the global economy for generations. They designed an elegant system. The United States dollar would be the anchor of international finance, convertible into gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would then peg to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. It was a gold standard with American characteristics, and it worked because America had something nobody else did after 6 years of global destruction: gold. Lots and lots of gold. By the mid-1940s, the United States held roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the world's official monetary gold reserves. The vaults at Fort Knox were overflowing. European central banks had shipped their bullion across the Atlantic to keep it safe from Nazi looters, and American war production had generated a mountain of trade surpluses paid in precious metal. When the Bretton Woods delegates signed their agreement, they were essentially acknowledging reality. America had the gold, so America would make the rules. And for about 15 years, the system worked beautifully. War-torn Europe and Japan rebuilt their economies using dollars. International trade boomed. The world entered a golden age of prosperity, pun absolutely intended. But there was a fatal flaw built into the architecture, and it would eventually bring the whole edifice crashing down. Economists would later call it the Triffin dilemma, named after the Belgian-American economist Triffin, who identified the problem in 1960. The logic was devastatingly simple. For the global economy to grow, the world needed more dollars, but the only way to get more dollars into foreign hands was for America to run deficits, spending and lending abroad than it took in. The more dollars that flooded out, the less credible America's promise to redeem them for gold became. The system required America to undermine the very foundation on which it stood. At first, nobody worried too much. American deficits were modest, and the gold pile remained enormous. But then came the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the construction of military bases encircling the Soviet Union, and eventually Vietnam. Dollars poured overseas like water through a broken dam, and foreign governments, particularly one led by a tall, very stubborn French general, started paying attention. If this story has a villain, or perhaps an anti-hero depending on your perspective, it's Charles de Gaulle. The towering French president had never forgotten how America treated his country during the war, sometimes more like a junior partner than an ally. He had rebuilt France from the humiliation of Nazi occupation into a proud nuclear power, and he despised what he saw as America's unfair advantage in the monetary system. French officials called it the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money that the entire world was obligated to accept. While other countries had to earn their dollars through exports or borrow them at interest, America could simply create them from nothing and buy real goods, real companies, real influence around the globe. De Gaulle understood power better than most men who ever lived. He had walked into Nazi-occupied Paris as a liberator, stared down army mutinies in Algeria, and built the Fifth Republic through sheer force of will. Now he turned that formidable intellect towards America's financial Achilles heel. He wasn't just complaining about the system, he was planning to challenge it. In early 1965, the French government began converting its dollar holdings into gold through official U.S. channels under Bretton Woods rules. On February 4, 1965, de Gaulle held a press conference at the Élysée Palace that sent shockwaves through the financial world. He argued that gold was the only truly stable and universal monetary standard, one that bore no single nation's mark and did not change in nature. He was calling for a return to the classical gold standard, a direct attack on America's monetary supremacy. France was an early and visible challenger to the system, but it was not alone. Other governments and markets took notice, accelerating pressure on U.S. gold reserves. Combined with broader runs on gold and speculative attacks on the dollar throughout the 1960s, the French challenge helped expose the fragility of the entire arrangement. This wasn't subtle financial maneuvering, it was an open challenge to American hegemony, and everyone could see where it was heading.
The Americans were furious, but trapped. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, they were legally obligated to exchange dollars for gold at the fixed rate. Refusing would admit that the emperor had no clothes, that there weren't enough gold bars in the vault to honor America's promises, so the gold kept flowing out. Now, this might be a good moment to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this financial archaeology. I promise there are no obligations attached, no conversion windows, and definitely no complicated exchange rate mechanisms involved. The like button also costs nothing and helps this channel reach more people who deserve to know how money actually works, or doesn't work, as the case may be. By 1968, the situation had become critical. Other countries had noticed what France was doing and started making their own gold withdrawals. Speculators, sensing weakness, began betting against the dollar. The London Gold Pool, a consortium of central banks that had worked together to maintain the official price, collapsed under the pressure. In March 1968, the gold market was effectively split in two. Central banks could still trade at $35 an ounce among themselves, but private buyers were paying whatever the market demanded. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, foreign dollar claims had grown beyond what U.S. monetary gold could credibly cover at $35 an ounce. Full convertibility had become impossible. Something had to give. Which brings us back to August 1971. On Friday the 13th, Nixon summoned his top economic advisors to Camp David for an emergency meeting. Treasury Secretary John Connally was there, along with Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Budget Director George Shultz, and a young undersecretary named Paul Volcker, who would later become one of the most consequential Fed chairmen in history. Notably absent were Secretary of State William Rogers and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. This was to be an economic operation, conducted in secret, without the usual diplomatic niceties. For 2 days, the group debated options in the mountain air of Maryland. Burns, the Fed chairman, reportedly opposed closing the gold window, but Connally, the swaggering Texan who had survived being shot during Kennedy's assassination, pushed hard for decisive action. Accounts of the weekend suggest timing and presentation mattered at least as much as mechanics. The speech needed to air before Asian markets opened on Monday morning, which meant Sunday night prime time. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States was about to unilaterally tear up the monetary agreement that had governed international finance for a quarter century. The announcement was scheduled on Sunday night prime time, and it would preempt Bonanza. His advisors convinced him that the timing was non-negotiable. The Cartwrights would have to wait. Nixon's address lasted about 18 minutes. He blamed the crisis on international money speculators who were waging an all-out war on the American dollar. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to fight inflation. He slapped a 10% surcharge on imports. And buried in the middle of his speech, almost as an afterthought, he directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. The key word was temporarily. Nixon assured Americans that this was not a devaluation, that for those who bought American products in America, the dollar would be worth just as much tomorrow as today. He promised to work with international partners to reform the monetary system. He spoke of defending the dollar, protecting American workers, creating new prosperity without war. In practice, the gold window would never reopen. The temporary suspension became permanent. Connally would later tell foreign finance ministers, with characteristic Texas bluntness, that the dollar was America's currency, but their problem. The rules of the game had changed, and everyone else would have to adapt. In the short term, the gambit worked brilliantly. American markets rallied. The press praised Nixon's decisive leadership. Polls showed 75% of Americans supported the plan. Most people had no idea what the gold standard was or why it mattered. All they knew was that their president was fighting speculators and protecting their paychecks. The fact that they were watching this news instead of their favorite show seemed a small price to pay. But the long-term consequences were staggering. In December 1971, the world's major economies agreed to the Smithsonian Agreement, a new set of fixed exchange rates centered on a devalued dollar. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 13 months. By March 1973, the attempt to maintain fixed rates had completely collapsed. The world stumbled into the era of floating exchange rates, where currencies bob up and down based on market forces, government intervention, and occasionally sheer panic. The inflation that followed in the 1970s was not entirely Nixon's fault, but his decision certainly didn't help. Freed from the discipline of gold convertibility, the Federal Reserve could print money without any external constraint, and print it did. Oil shocks and domestic policy choices also played major roles in the decade's economic turmoil. But the underlying monetary instability made everything worse. For calendar year 1974, CPI rose 12.2%. The purchasing power of the dollar, measured against gold, would collapse dramatically over the next decade as the gold price surged from $35 to over $800 per ounce by 1980. For ordinary Americans, this meant watching their savings melt away like ice cream on a summer sidewalk. A worker who retired in 1971 with what seemed like a comfortable nest egg found that it bought less and less each year. Mortgage rates later peaked above 18%, hitting 18.63% in 1981. The American dream of homeownership became a mathematical nightmare for an entire generation. The stagflation of the 1970s, that miserable combination of stagnant growth and persistent inflation, was the direct offspring of the monetary chaos Nixon unleashed. Gas lines, disco, malaise. The entire cultural atmosphere of the 1970s was shaped by the economic anxiety that flowed from Nixon's television address. And yet, from another angle, Nixon's decision was inevitable. The Bretton Woods system was already dying. America's gold reserves had been depleted by decades of overseas commitments that voters supported and politicians promised. The choice wasn't between maintaining the gold standard and abandoning it. The choice was between an orderly retreat and a humiliating rout. Nixon chose to frame the retreat as a victory, and in the short run, he got away with it. The deeper lesson here isn't about gold versus paper money. It's about promises and their limits. For 27 years, the United States had promised the world that dollars were as good as gold. When keeping that promise became inconvenient, the promise was broken, not renegotiated, not gradually wound down, but announced on Sunday night television between commercials for Chevrolet and Philip Morris. De Gaulle, who had died the year before Nixon's announcement, would have told you so. The French had seen through the illusion. They had recognized that a paper promise is only as good as the power and willingness to honor it, and they had acted accordingly, exchanging their paper for something tangible while the window was still open. The story of money is never just about coins and bills. It's about trust, power, and the distance between what nations promise and what they actually deliver. Nixon's decision in 1971 didn't create the problems of fiat currency, but it certainly accelerated them. We're still living with the consequences today, every time a central bank fires up the printing press to paper over a crisis.